Shalom, everyone. This is Tom Thorne from Abdei El Elyon, Servants of the Most High God Ministries, and today is February 15th, 2023. Today's message is part 2 of our 4-part series on 1 Samuel 28 through 31, the overall series title being An End and a Beginning. Today's class, we're going to focus on, in today's class, part 2, we're going to cover 1 Samuel 28, verses 5 through 25. And the title to today's class is, Two Wrongs Don't Make a Right. In our first message on this series, on the series of the 1 Samuel 28 through 31 literary unit, we saw how the Philistines were preparing to make war with Israel. For 16 months, David had been in close proximity with Achish, king of Gath. Gath being one of the 5 lead Philistine cities. And that Achish expected David to go to war with him on his side against Israel. In 1 Samuel 28 verse 4, we saw that the Philistines and Israel were assembled for war. The Philistines at Shunem, Saul and Israel at Gilboa. As a point of reference, Shunem was about 50 miles north of modern-day Jerusalem. In chapter 28, verses 5 through 25, we will see how Saul faced up to the enemies of Israel. In so doing, we will see that instead of having faith in God, Saul let fear overtake him, and he grievously disobeyed. In fact, he disobeyed twice or 3 times. And we're going to see that Saul's final error was a combination of 2 wrongs. And we're all aware of the old expression, 2 wrongs don't make a right. My hope is that with the review of this material, we will be strengthened and encouraged, especially in times of trial, not to be overcome by fear, and to stay true to the teachings of God. So that catches us up. Let's read 1 Samuel 28, 1 through 4, once again, just to make sure we're completely caught up. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "Understand that you and your men are to go to war with me in the army." David said to Achish, "Very well, you shall know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." Verse 3, Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him, and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. And verse 4, The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. Okay, so that brings us up to date. Now let's start with today's material, verse 5. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. In verse 5, we see that Saul was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. This was more than just being afraid. The Hebrew word for heart here is lave. This noun has 3 general meanings: heart, mind, or will. We might very well have been able to say that all 3 of these aspects of Saul's lave, his heart, were affected. Saul's heart and emotions were probably at an all-time low, fearing the loss of his kingdom. That's his heart. Saul was not thinking right, which is evidenced by his further actions. That's his mind. And Saul's willpower was gone, as evidenced by his fear, not waiting on the Lord and not approaching the battle with faith and confidence. That's his will. So Saul's heart, mind, and will were all affected. Probably the most extreme feeling of fear I ever had was one time when I was a teenager. I think I was 18. I was driving along Interstate 94 in northwest Indiana on a cold winter evening. It was about 7 p.m. It was cold, but there was no snow or ice on the roads, and driving was fine. When I got to the point where I was about 12 miles from home, it started snowing, and snowing hard. I limped along at a slow pace for about 5 miles, as I-94 was a major east-west interstate highway with 3 lanes in both directions that ran through northern Indiana, through Chicago, and up into Wisconsin. I was moving along in the first lane at about 45, pretty slow, as visibility was really getting bad. The third lane by this time was completely covered with snow, and no cars were using it. And the second lane was getting covered. Driving was getting worse by the 1/10 of a mile. But I had driven on snow-covered roads several times before in the past, and I was young, and I was young, and I was just not really concerned, just cautious. Then suddenly, I saw an object ahead of me that looked like it wasn't moving. I slowed down and looked in the rearview mirror to see where the cars were around me. Well, there was a car in the second lane right at my driver's side rear bumper, and an 18-wheeler probably about a car and a half length behind me. A couple seconds later, I could make out what was ahead of me. It was a car stopped dead in its tracks, right in the highway, directly in front of me. And to make matters worse, there was a person standing outside the car, on the rear end of his car, between me and his car, between my approaching vehicle and his car. I had a split-second decision to make as I was getting closer and closer. I was slowing down, of course, but I didn't slam on the brakes yet. I could have slammed on the brakes to try to stop in time so that I wouldn't hit the individual in front of me. But I really didn't think, with the roads as they were, I could stop in that short of a distance. And if I hit the brakes that hard, surely I would have spinned either into the second lane or off the road. Or I could have tried to move over into the second lane. As it was, the car that was at my driver's side bumper was now in the process of passing me. And the semi, who was right behind me, was just moving over into the second lane. I was totally trapped. And I needed to do something immediately. I could try to slow down to avoid the person in front of me, but I was convinced that I wouldn't be able to stop in time. I would hit the person and possibly kill him and injure myself. I don't know why, but that person just wasn't moving to the side. Or I could try to move over into the second lane, but I was sure if I did that, the semi would hit me and probably kill me. And besides that, if the semi did try to move over, with the roads as they were, I was convinced that he would probably go into a tailspin, and who knows what might happen then. He might jackknife, he might flip. There were many possibilities, and it appeared that none of them were good. I was terrified. In what couldn't have been more than a couple of seconds at the most, it seemed as if my whole life flashed before me. I decided that killing a person was not going to be on my rap sheet in heaven. For what couldn't have been more than a couple of seconds, I went totally limp. I lost all strength and gave what I felt was one last repentance. Then I proceeded to move over into the second lane, bracing myself, waiting to get hit. Somehow, I don't know how, the driver of the 18-wheeler was able to maneuver his vehicle over enough in those few crucial seconds so that he only hit the front end of my car. To my remembrance, the car was spun in about 540 degrees, but neither the person with the stopped car in front of me nor I was hurt. I assume the truck driver was fine too, as I never saw him again. I was able to get my car home. I was able to limp the car home, and my dad was not happy. It was really his car, and it was totaled, but lives had been spared. I was scared out of my wits. If you consider my position in this instance and multiply it by about 10, you probably have the feeling of how frightened Saul was. After all, his life was at stake. His family's life. The state of the whole country that he was king of. and his dynasty. Everything was at stake for Saul. What caused this great fear? Why was Saul so afraid? He saw God fight for him in the past. I think that the fear Saul experienced wasn't an emotion that came upon him all at once, but rather a progression. Saul knew that he had not obeyed the Lord. He had not obeyed Yahweh. He had to know that all the time he spent chasing down David with the intent of taking his life was not pleasing to God. He had been confronted by Samuel at Gilgal back in chapter 13 for not keeping the commandment of the Lord his God. Saul did not respect God's holiness as he usurped the role of the priests. He was told that his kingdom would not continue in 1 Samuel 13:14. In 1 Samuel 15, he once again clearly disobeyed God's commands again by not destroying the Amalekites. Once again, he was reproached by Samuel, who told him in verses 22 through 23, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh and obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, because you have rejected the word of Yahweh, he has also rejected you from being king." Add to this the fact that Saul knew David was hiding out with the Philistines near Gath. We're told that in 1 Samuel 27 verse 4. He knew that David was hiding out with the Philistines. He also knew of the power and force that David and his 600 mighty men displayed. He may have thought that the Philistine army by itself was more than a formidable foe, but for all he knew, David was fighting with them. This could have exponentially added to the fear factor. Yet, in a nutshell, all of this fear that Saul had was a result of disobedience. So let's move on to verse 6. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Saul now found himself in a very dangerous position. Samuel was dead. There was no way to consult him. The army of the Philistines was set to war against Israel, and his prayers were not being answered. This verse could imply that Saul had prayed, called on the priests for answers, and requested advice from the prophets as well, none of which were providing him with direction, or at least no one was coming forth to Saul with answers. Verse 7, Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servant said to him, "Behold, there is a medium at Endor." Endor was about 6 miles north of Mount Gilboa, where the Israelites had camped in verse 4. Because of disobedience, Saul made his first mistake. He was terrified and didn't trust in the Lord to fight his battles. When fear is an expression of unbelief or distrust in God's nature, character, or promises, it is sin. Yeshua Jesus tells us in Matthew 6:25 not to be envious about anything. And in verse 33, to seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things, everything we need, will be added to you. Here, have there ever been times in your life, in the midst of a bad snowstorm or in terrible weather, when the electricity and the phone lines were both down, and you experienced fear? Genesis 3:8 through 13. In Genesis 3:8 through 13, we read where Adam and Eve listened to the serpent instead of God. And they hid themselves from God. They were afraid. They were not trusting the words of God, and it was wrong. Likewise with Saul. Instead of listening to God and following God's teachings throughout his life, communication with God had become severed. It had become cut, disconnected, completely gone. And Saul was afraid. So now, to try to rectify the situation, Saul proceeded with another wrong action. He sought after the medium nearby Endor, who had somehow survived the purge that he had previously made. Saul is here commanding his servants to seek out, find quickly a medium, so that he could go and inquire of her. Saul had to be aware of the commands of God not to do such a thing. Indeed, God was not answering him. So instead of waiting on the Lord with faith, he consulted a medium, which he had been told again and again not to do. The Bible tells that in Leviticus 20 verse 7, Leviticus 19:31, Leviticus 20 verse 6, Deuteronomy 18:10 through 14. Saul had to know about this. Now let's continue with verses 8 through 10. So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments as he went. He and 2 men went with him, and they came to the woman by night, and he said, "Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whoever I shall name to you." The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death?" But Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, as Yahweh lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Here we have another example of disobedience to God's laws. It was wrong enough for Saul to approach the woman at Endor, but he also attempted to deceive her. He knew the 9th commandment well, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." When Saul asked the woman to bring up whoever he asked her to, she told him that Saul had put all the mediums out from the land and asked him if he was trying to set a trap for her. To which Saul replied that he was not setting a trap. Saul swore, made a pledge, promised solemnly, invoking a divine witness, Yahweh, that no punishment would come upon the woman if she did this. How could he make this promise with that authority unless he was the king? Up until this time, disguised as he was, the woman did not know that he was the king. Saul was getting himself deeper and deeper into trouble. He shouldn't have appealed to this woman, a medium, in the first place. He deceived her into thinking he was someone rather than who he was. Now he promised her protection for actions she should not have been involved in, something he could not make, promise he could not make. Verses 11 through 12. Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He said, bring up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The woman asked Saul who he wanted her to bring up for him. And he said, "Samuel." By the way this sentence is written in Hebrew, Saul seemed to be more than just asking. He could have very well been demanding of this woman. Using her demonic powers of necromancy, the woman called up what she expected to be an apparition of Samuel, something that would make Saul believe that it was really Samuel. But Samuel's actual appearance startled and frightened her. She cried out with a loud voice, and she realized that this was the work of God, not herself. At the same time, she realized that her nighttime visitor was King Saul. This shows us that she did not really expect to raise up Samuel, but only a satanic imitation. Moving on to verses 13 through 14. The king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a god, lowercase g, coming up out of the earth." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel. And he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. She described the vision as of a spirit and as an old man clad in a robe. Saul knew it was Samuel. That Samuel's appearance, even in visionary form, was not the expected result clearly teaches that necromancers or mediums have no real power over the deceased, especially the righteous, but can only produce counterfeits. Now, this is a difficult scripture here. Questions naturally arise at this point. Did the medium actually make contact with a living spirit being? And if so, was it really the prophet Samuel? While this matter is not likely to be settled to everybody's satisfaction here, the following observations can be made. I'm not going to say 100% in one way or another. I'm just going to make some observations. First, the plain statement of the Hebrew text is that she did in fact see Samuel. That's what it says. Second, the medium reacted to Samuel's appearance as though it was a genuine and terrifying experience. She cried out at the top of her voice. Her strong reaction also suggests that Samuel's appearance was unexpected. Perhaps this is the first time she'd ever actually succeeded in contacting the dead. Very probably. Third, the speeches attributed to Samuel contained allusions to a prior interchange between the two, allusions that may have been appropriate only for the real Samuel to have made. Fourth, Samuel's role and message as a prophet, so much a part of his ministry in life, was unchanged in his encounter with Saul here. Even though mediums may have the ability to contact spirits, this does not mean spirits of God. The Torah prohibits necromancy because it promotes reliance on supernatural guidance from some source other than the Lord, other than God. Now, an alternative reading of this passage suggests that it was not the skill of the medium, but rather a unique act of God that brought Saul into contact with Samuel. The medium did not possess the capability to disturb a dead saint, but God, as a sign of his peace, possibly permitted Saul to have one last encounter with a prophet who he had first sought so long ago in pursuit of his father's lost donkeys. There are four main viewpoints on the appearance of Samuel. The first is that the appearance of Samuel was not a literal one, but merely the product of psychological impressions. The second is that a demon or Satan was impersonating Samuel. The third, the whole thing was a deliberate imposture practiced upon Saul. The witch really did not see Samuel, but fooled Samuel into believing her voice, or that of someone else, was that of Samuel. And fourth, that it was a genuine appearance of Samuel, brought about by God himself in favor of this proposal, In favor of this proposal is a Septuagint reading of 1 Chronicles 10:13, which reads, Saul inquired of a wizard to seek counsel, and Samuel the prophet answered him. It may appear that Samuel's appearance here is explained by the intervention of Yahweh, who in his love and mercy permitted Saul one last encounter with the prophet. That's a possibility. I'm not saying for sure. I just wanted to throw out the possibilities there. Nevertheless, this is a sad story. Moving on to verses 15 through 17. Then Samuel said to Saul, Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I should do. And Samuel said, Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done for you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn your kingdom from out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Samuel did not provide Saul with the information he desired. Instead, he reassured his role as the Lord's prophet and picked up where he left off in his judgment, his last judgment of the king. Once again, he stressed the importance of obedience to the Lord by probing Saul's motives. If Saul knew that the Lord had turned away from him and become his adversary, why did he choose to make the Lord even angrier by violating the Torah's explicit ban on consulting the dead? Why did he choose to make the Lord even angrier by violating the Torah's, the law's explicit ban on consulting the dead? One may wonder at Samuel's response in verse 16. Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Hebrew arek is the word used here for enemy or adversary. It's hard to think of God as being an enemy to anyone. Yet, instead of repenting, Saul went completely against the law of God by seeking the woman, the medium at Endor. God must be an enemy to such actions. As believers in and followers of Yeshua Jesus, we must consider whether some of our actions make us a friend or an enemy, adversary of His. Verses 18 through 19. Because you did not obey the voice of Yahweh, and did not carry out His fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines. Saul had been told the importance of obedience before. Samuel told Saul to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, the Shema, which I am sure Saul had memorized, reinforces listening to and obeying God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The word Shema itself means to hear, listen, obey. Back in Leviticus 20, verse 6, the Lord Yahweh said to Moses, if a person turns to mediums and necromancers, whoring after them, I will set my face against that person and cut him off from among his people. Now moving on to verses 20 through 25, 1 Samuel 5, verses 20 through 25. 1 Samuel 29, verses 20 through 25. 28, 20 through 25, I'm sorry. 28, 20 through 25. Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand, and have listened to you. Listen to what you have said to me. Now therefore, you also obey your servant. Obey me, she's telling him. Let me set a morsel of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. He refused and said, I will not eat. But his servants together with the woman urged him, and she listened to their words. So he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly killed it, and she took the flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. 1 Samuel 28, verses 20 through 25. The words for Samuel were more than the king could bear. Saul probably was more filled with fear than ever. The stress associated with the Philistine army, the risky 6-mile trip around the Philistine encampment to the medium's house, and the words of Samuel completely drained him of any energy reserves that he had left. The woman offered him some food. Initially he declined, but after the prodding of his servants and the woman, he capitulated and ate. They ate, then they rose and went away that night. At this point, we need to stop and think. Here was the man who was head and shoulders taller than the rest, a handsome man. In fact, there was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome. From the battles Israel won during his reign, he was obviously an excellent military strategist. He had a great son, and we might assume a fine family. But everything was coming to an end. He was told by Samuel that his archenemy, the Philistines, was going to defeat his army, and that he and his sons would die tomorrow. And he had no choice. He had to believe it. In the last part of this message today, I want to talk about one of Saul's big issues, fear. Back in verse 5 we read, when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. And then, when he didn't receive a response from the Lord as he expected, he was probably even more afraid. Fear is one of the strongest human emotions there is. Fear is defined as a distressing emotion that arises Fear is defined as a distressing emotion that arises when a perceived danger or threat is present. Although fear can also have a positive component. For example, probably the first time I ever drove in downtown Gary, Indiana, which at the time was a city about the same population as Raleigh, North Carolina, I found myself turning down a one-way street and saw cars heading at me the other opposite direction, heading right toward me. In fact, I remember one driver, I can picture it in my mind, this is 45 years ago, I can still picture this guy telling me, wrong way. Fear triggered an automatic response that sent a message to my brain to get out of this situation as fast as I could, turn around as fast as possible, which I did to get out of the dangerous situation. A second type of fear is the fear of the Lord, both in terms of deep respect and being concerned about breaking His laws, doing things He says not to do. Well, I'm not talking about either of these two kinds of fear. Fear becomes a problem when a person is afraid of things that are not real. The feeling is out of proportion to the real danger. It becomes an ongoing and continual event. It is in contradiction to the words of God, or it displays a lack of faith in God. This is when fear becomes a problem. God tells us numerous times in the Bible not to fear. The Israelites were told again and again not to fear their enemies, but to trust in Yahweh. In Matthew 10:28, Jesus, Yeshua, instructed His disciples, do not fear those who will kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear Him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And as shown from the life of Saul, fear can lead to disastrous decisions. Yet fear seems to happen to everyone occasionally. Let's consider our lives today in 2023 and the consequences of unbridled and untamed fear. How do we tackle this problem? What should we do? When we are in a state of continual fear, several things can happen. First of all, the wrong type of fear shows a lack of trust, faith, and confidence in God. Secondly, fear can lead to fast decisions with little thought or counsel. Often these decisions are poor. When the heart of Saul greatly trembled, he made an extremely bad decision to go visit the medium at Endor. Third, at times, fear can cause us to freeze or cower in fear and do nothing, which can be disastrous too. It can also cause us to become engrossed in our own problems and magnify the situation many times. Before long, we can become far more concerned than we should be. When we lose trust in God and are excessively concerned with ourselves, disobedience and poor decisions are almost always a certain result. One of the, if not the, most greatest basketball players ever was Michael Jordan, who led the Chicago Bulls to 6 league championships in 8 years. I know that Michael Jordan was a tremendously gifted person with a tremendous amount of natural ability. And that was one of the things that made him such a great basketball player, no doubt. But there's also another story to Michael Jordan's career. As good of a natural basketball player as he was often one of the last players to leave the practice sessions, shooting baskets and improving his game. He practiced and practiced. After playing the game for a few years, it became apparent that his three-point shot needed to be improved. He practiced three-point shots and got better at them. This made the most potent offensive player in the game even stronger. When tense, nerve-wracking situations arise, will we be prepared with a strong defense to guard against the pulls of the enemy and one of his favorite ploys, fear? Will we have a potent offense to tread right over this powerful emotion? We can also practice by reading God's Word and inspirational writings from servants of the Lord, studying the pages of the Bible, prayer, and meditation. When we regularly and often practice in this way, and tense situations arise, we will have internalized the words of the Bible, and we will be able to remember the stories, remember them, and be strengthened by them. Stories when God delivered His people miraculously. Stories of when the Lord overpowered Pharaoh and the Israelites walked out of Egypt through walls of water on both sides. Stories of when, through the power of God, the teenager David defeated the most powerful warrior in the Philistine army, Goliath. Stories of when Jesus, Yeshua, overcame the adversary and said, "Be gone, Satan," and he had to flee. Not only stories from the Bible, but we will remember situations in our own lives where God intervened. Situations where He saved the lives of friends, relatives, or even ourselves. Situations of miraculous healings, financial blessings, or the fixing of relational issues. Stories of bringing people to salvation. We can't let the fears experienced by others erode our faith. Fear is contagious. If we listen to it long enough, we will become infected. No, we shouldn't be isolated from the world, but we must be insulated against its negative consequences. God, Jesus, Holy Spirit will allow these internalizations and remembrances to strengthen us and allow us to defeat the power of the adversary and say Lila Tov, or good night, to fear. In about 1010 BC, as recorded for us in 1 Samuel 28, Saul was in great fear when he saw the Philistine army. He was even more concerned when he didn't receive answers from the Lord as he expected. Fear was his first mistake in this instance. That fear led to another drastic mistake, seeking consultation from a medium at Endor. This, you might say, was the last straw, and two wrongs don't make a right. Saul's successor, David, faced many situations where he had the temptation to fall into a state of prolonged fear. Yet he counseled us in Psalm 27:14, "Wait on the Lord. Fear not, and let your heart take courage. Wait on the Lord." Let's all remember that to conquer fear, we need to practice and internalize the teachings of God. We need to remember His mighty works in the pages of the Bible, other people's lives, and our own lives. We need to wait on the Lord, and we will be strengthened. In our message today, we reviewed Saul's final days leading up to the Philistine conquest of Israel in 1010 BC. We discussed how Saul made two mistakes. We reviewed the negative consequences of the wrong type of fear and a strategy for us to overcome fear. In part 3 of this series, we will continue our study, moving into 1 Samuel 29 and 30, where the storyline takes a detour into the life of David and his men at the same time, with quite different results. In closing, let me quote Psalm 27, verse 14 again. Wait for the Lord. Be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. And I'd like to read the Aaronic blessing to us in closing. Number 6, 24 through 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance on you and give you peace. Yivreka Yahweh v'yishmereka. Ya'er Yahweh panav elecha v'huneka. Yasa Yahweh panav elecha v'yasem leka shalom. Shalom, everyone, and Shavua Tov. Have a good week.